Victoria Blackwell looked at Nolan Pierce's work jacket, then deliberately dragged her chair 3 inches to the left, putting physical distance between herself and the man she assumed was just another hired hand. Right in front of her assembled executive team, the chief executive announced with crystal clear articulation that she did not share dining space with manual labor, instructing the floor manager to relocate him to an empty table near the service exit. Nolan didn't raise his voice or start an argument. He simply set his cloth napkin beside his unused water glass and asked whether Eleanor Blackwell had been informed of this seating arrangement. Victoria offered a sharp, breathy laugh, telling him her mother would never extend an invitation to someone wearing steel-toed boots. At that exact moment, the private elevator chimed. Eleanor Blackwell stepped out into the room, placed a sealed genetic testing dossier directly in the center of the mahogany table, and said that Victoria should probably read every word of it before she insulted him a second time. If you appreciate stories where entrenched corporate arrogance collapses under the weight of unvarnished truth, stay with Nolan through what happened that night and see the kind of reckoning he ultimately walked away with. I need to take you back 4 hours earlier, down into the concrete and copper labyrinth of the Blackwell Grand Manhattan in downtown New York, because that was where the man everyone would soon be arguing over was spending his Tuesday evening. Nolan Pierce was 43 years old, kneeling in front of a sprawling electrical distribution cabinet with a tactical flashlight clamped between his teeth, while a junior facility engineer babbled nervously about how the central climate automation system had been cycling into emergency shutdowns for 48 straight hours. There was an international urban development gala scheduled in the Grand Ballroom the following evening, boasting 900 guests, 2 city council members, local network news crews, and a general manager who looked like he was one tripped breaker away from a total nervous breakdown. Nolan traced the fault to a faulty firmware patch pushed by an outside automation vendor who had completely botched the network handoff logic, and he rewrote the communication protocols right there on a ruggedized laptop balanced on a rolling linen bin. When the primary chillers finally hummed back into a stable, rhythmic purr, 2 veteran housekeepers who had paused near the service door offered a quiet, single round of applause. I mention this because only a few hours later, a woman would glance at the faint layer of drywall dust along the welt of his boots and decide she already knew the entire trajectory of his life. Nolan owned a firm called Pierce Operations Group, which wasn't the kind of outfit that spent marketing capital on sponsored golf tournaments or lobby billboards. He had 19 full-time specialists, a leased workspace out in New Jersey, and a client roster consisting of high-end commercial property groups who dialed his direct number the way a trauma center calls a specialist, quietly, urgently, and only when something vital was actively failing. He drove a 7-year-old sedan, wore an indestructible mechanical watch he'd bought off a fellow contractor a decade prior, and lived alone in a house where his 15-year-old daughter, Leia, regularly sent him photos of her AP chemistry lab reports with the frantic caption, "Send rescue." His wife had passed away 4 years earlier in a sterile hospital room down in Philadelphia, a route he still avoided every time he had to drive south. 3 weeks before that gala, an unfamiliar number had flashed on his phone, answered by a woman whose voice carried an unusual mixture of rigid formality and underlying vulnerability. She identified herself as Eleanor Blackwell, 67 years old, chairperson emeritus of Blackwell Hospitality, explaining that she had spent years tracking down a child born in a municipal hospital in western Pennsylvania on a cold Tuesday morning in February 1983. She made it clear right away that she wasn't calling about commercial contracts or consulting retainers. Nolan had walked over to his office window, listening to the heavy thud of his own pulse against his ribs. He had been adopted at 11 days old by a machinist and a school secretary who raised him with fierce, unpretentious affection and he had never wasted energy hunting for biological roots because he believed a man shouldn't go begging for an origin story. They met twice, both times in obscure diners off the turnpike where no corporate scout would ever wander. And both times, Nolan declined everything she offered except the coffee and the conversation. Eleanor brought court-unsealed adoption registries, institutional transfer receipts, and a faded photograph of herself at 19, featuring a jawline and eyes that were undeniably a softer, earlier edition of his own. He studied the image for a long time before telling her that paperwork and bone structure didn't automatically constitute a mother-son bond, and that he wasn't interested in constructing an emotional architecture on coincidence alone. When he suggested an independent, court-supervised genetic verification through a neutral medical facility, Eleanor agreed instantly, her reaction confirming that she had been bracing herself for his skepticism. 4 days before the corporate dinner, she sent him a short text reading simply, "I need you in that room tonight, and I need you to come as yourself." What Nolan didn't know, and what I knew from the moment the catering manifests were printed, was that Blackwell Hospitality was exactly 6 days from finalizing a massive expansion buyout worth $420 million with an institutional investment syndicate led by a meticulous, soft-spoken strategist named Preston Kingsley. Victoria Blackwell, 39 years old and sitting in the chief executive's chair for just over 2 years, had orchestrated the evening like a Broadway director staging a final curtain call. The 54th floor private dining suite had been completely cordoned off from the rest of the hotel, featuring custom calligraphy place cards, a visiting sommelier imported from a boutique Charleston estate, and a seating arrangement Victoria had scrutinized down to the millimeter. That meticulous oversight was precisely why she noticed the anomaly instantly. Her mother had inserted a completely unfamiliar name right into the primary tier of guests. Victoria had initially assumed it was a meaningless administrative courtesy extended to some retiring regional property supervisor, choosing not to ask because asking would require admitting there was a blind spot in her own organizational control. So, when the private elevator doors slid open at precisely 7:07 p.m. and a man stepped out wearing a canvas work jacket with a laminated contractor badge still clipped to the breast pocket, Victoria's entire worldview instantly categorized him as an embarrassing logistical error. Rather than letting a hostess intercept him, Victoria crossed the polished floor herself, not out of hospitality, but because she preferred to manage disruptions personally. She informed him politely that the dining room had been entirely reserved for a private executive function and suggested that service personnel use the freight elevators around the corner. Nolan simply nodded, reached into his inside pocket, and withdrew a heavy cardstock invitation bearing Eleanor Blackwell's unmistakable signature. Victoria read it twice, her expression tightening into something cold and efficient. To her, a logistical error was simply something to be corrected before anyone else noticed. She smiled thinly, remarking that her mother was far too generous with the support staff, delivering the words with the casual condescension of someone speaking to a child. Nolan replied calmly that Eleanor might have invited him for an entirely different purpose, and in that half-second, Victoria silently dismissed him as a man grasping for an importance he hadn't earned. When she asked what his actual function was, he told her he ran an operations consultancy, to which she responded with patronizing patience that this still classified him simply as an external contractor. The hostess approached with a spare place card, which Victoria took without glancing at it, flipping it face down before instructing the restaurant manager in a low voice to relocate Mr. Pierce away from the main table. Nolan watched quietly as the small piece of cardstock bearing his name vanished into the manager's apron pocket. Over the next 11 minutes, the remaining invitees filtered into the private room in an order that silently mapped out the entire corporate hierarchy. Daniel Huxley arrived first, the long-standing chief operating officer, whose face had spent 2 decades molding itself into an expression of impenetrable neutrality. Marissa Caldwell followed closely behind, a seasoned board member who had previously steered 2 major airline conglomerates and possessed zero tolerance for superficial pleasantries. Preston Kingsley arrived last, carrying a slim leather portfolio tucked under his arm, and taking a full 90 seconds to scan the perimeter of the room before speaking a single word. Nolan recognized all 3 names from months of encrypted corporate email chains, yet he had never met any of them face to face, because every prior technical engagement had been safely routed through automated procurement portals and subordinate managers. It served as a stark, glaring reminder of how corporate invisibility actually operates in the modern world. It is rarely an orchestrated conspiracy, but rather the frictionless cruelty of an automated workflow. Victoria opened the evening with practiced, effortless charm, delivering a 9-minute opening address that touched seamlessly on regional occupancy metrics, capital acquisitions, and her father's foundational legacy. Then, her gaze drifted across the expansive dining room, catching Nolan standing near the floor-to-ceiling glass windows with a simple glass of tap water he had poured himself. Prompted by an inexplicable compulsion to account for his presence out loud, she elevated her voice just enough to command the attention of the entire table, and inquired how many years he had spent in manual maintenance work. Nolan answered evenly that he did not do routine maintenance, explaining that his boutique firm specialized in redesigning failing control architecture for commercial properties in crisis, and that he had spent his entire afternoon down in the sub-basement, preventing the venue's climate control units from triggering a complete structural shutdown. Victoria offered a light, dismissive breath and repeated the word contractor, letting it hang heavily in the air like an unwanted stain on a pristine white tablecloth. Marissa Caldwell quietly set her wine glass down without taking a single sip. The service captain stepped forward, clutching the original seating chart Eleanor had meticulously organized, attempting to discreetly place Nolan at the foot of the primary table as originally intended. But the moment Victoria noticed the movement, she intervened sharply, instructing the captain to relocate Mr. Pierce to the isolated deuce table tucked away by the service station near the kitchen doors. The captain hesitated for a single, agonizing heartbeat, long enough for everyone seated at the mahogany table to register the silent injustice of the act, before complying, because he had a daughter starting university in the autumn and a mortgage to clear in Queens. Nolan looked at the lonely table flanked by racks of empty water pitchers, and instead of making a scene, he calmly carried his glass across the floor and sat down, thanking the busser who handed him a piece of warm bread. At 7:41 p.m., Nolan's phone buzzed against the white linen table runner. The message was from Eleanor, 5 words long, read 3 times. "The results have arrived. I'm coming." She didn't say what the results contained. She didn't say whether she had broken the seal. Nolan set his phone face down, looked out at the New York skyline through thick glass, and understood that in a matter of minutes he would find out whether he was about to meet his biological mother at a formal dinner table with a paper napkin on his lap. He felt his pulse thumping behind his collarbone. He also felt, with a quiet, human sting, a sharp curiosity about how Victoria Blackwell's expression would warp when the puzzle pieces finally snapped together. The private elevator chimed. The doors slid open to reveal Eleanor Blackwell in a charcoal evening dress, moving with a slight limp from a hip replacement surgery performed that spring, clutching a plain white envelope against her chest, the way people hold things they are terrified of dropping. Eleanor had run the company for 19 years before handing the reins to her daughter. She still controlled 31% of the voting stock, and the moment she stepped onto the 54th floor, her eyes bypassed every executive at the mahogany table and went straight to the empty space near the service exit. She did not speak for 4 full seconds. In a high society room, 4 seconds of silence is an eternity. She looked at the gap in the seating chart, looked down at the floorman's shuffling feet, and then tracked her gaze across the room until she found Nolan sitting alone by the water pitchers with a piece of bread and no wine. Something shifted across Eleanor's face, a mixture of profound grief and a terrifying, cold realization. Marissa Caldwell later admitted she thought it was rage. Preston Kingsley thought it was heartbreak. It was both. Eleanor asked in a low-level voice who had altered her seating chart. Victoria answered immediately. To her credit, Victoria was never a coward. She did not hide behind her staff. She stated clearly that she had reviewed the guest list and concluded that Mr. Pierce did not fit the appropriate profile of an executive dinner, treating her modification as a routine administrative correction. Eleanor asked in what way he was inappropriate. Victoria listed his credentials. Not a board member, not an investor, not an executive of any material enterprise, just a small-scale service contractor. Before Victoria could finish, Daniel Huxley cleared his throat. Pierce Operations Group, he muttered. Eleanor looked directly at her chief operating officer and asked who had saved the Blackwell Grand Chicago from a 3-week structural shutdown after the fire suppression failure 12 months prior. Daniel replied, Pierce Operations. Eleanor asked who had re-engineered the entire housekeeping and engineering protocol that slashed labor overtime across the portfolio by 19%, a metric highlighted proudly in the second paragraph of the investor letter Victoria had published that spring. Daniel answered quietly, Pierce Operations. And, because his professional conscience finally overtook his caution, Mr. Pierce personally led those engagements and refused a success fee on the Chicago project because the root failure originated from an oversight in our own architectural specs. For the first time all evening, Victoria looked at the man in the corner, not as a category error, but as a variable. She recovered fast, arguing that vendors performing well was simply the expected outcome of standard procurement contracts, and that professional competence was not an automatic ticket to a family table. Eleanor did not argue. She walked straight to the primary table, placed the plain white envelope down on the linen precisely where his place card should have been, and let go of it. Her fingers trembled once. The return address on the upper left corner belonged to an independent genetic diagnostics laboratory in Rockville, Maryland. Below it were 4 crisp words: DNA, relationship analysis, confidential. Victoria leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the upside-down print. She asked her mother what the document was. Eleanor sat down, arranged her hands in her lap, and began to speak with a steady, punishing composure that cost her everything. She spoke of the summer of 1982, when she was 19, and her last name was not yet Blackwell. She recounted falling in love with a young music student who repaired woodwinds, discovering her pregnancy by October, and facing a family structure that treated corporate mergers with more gravity than human life. She was sent away to an isolated estate in upstate New York. The boy was told she had vanished to Europe. She recounted the freezing morning in February 1983 when her son was born, 7 pounds, 11 ounces, holding him for exactly 11 minutes before a nurse in a cardigan took him out of the room. She signed the adoption surrender papers on a clipboard in a sterile hallway, while her father's legal counsel stood watch. The records were sealed that same week. 14 months later, she married Charles Blackwell, learned to love him in time, bore 2 more children, and buried the secret so deeply that by the time she turned 30, her entire existence had become load-bearing silence. Victoria's face drained of color, matching the white tablecloth. She had grown up surrounded by oil paintings of 4 generations, utterly convinced she possessed the absolute inventory of her own bloodline. Eleanor explained how, following her husband's death 6 years prior, she had initiated a private search involving 2 court petitions, an 11-month legal battle with a superior court judge in Harrisburg, and a mountain of legal fees. It had culminated in a trail of papers leading to an adoption finalized in Erie, Pennsylvania, by a machinist and a school secretary named Pierce, and finally, to a man running an infrastructure firm who had walked through her hotels hundreds of times without knowing whose name was on the building. Victoria turned her head, truly looking at Nolan for the very first time, searching his face for family lines instead of dismissing him as manual labor. She asked him if it was true. Nolan stood up from the deuce table by the kitchen doors. He did not raise his voice. He said that records can be flawed and hope makes them worse, and that finding a shared surname doesn't automatically grant a family tree. He explained that he was the one who had insisted on an independent, court-supervised legal test at a neutral facility 14 days prior, handled entirely by a third-party attorney, so no one could ever claim a Blackwell had manipulated the outcome. Then, he dropped the sentence that altered the air pressure in the room. I haven't read it either. It went straight to her, and I asked her not to tell me over the phone. Victoria slid a butter knife under the flap of the envelope and pulled out a single folded sheet bearing the laboratory letterhead, a formal case number, and a data table of 24 genetic markers. Her eyes swept down to the final conclusion. Based on comprehensive chromosomal analysis, the probability of maternity is 99.99%. The tested individual, Eleanor Margaret Blackwell, cannot be excluded as the biological mother of the tested individual, Nolan James Pierce. Victoria Blackwell had spent the last hour explaining to a room full of international investors why the man by the service station had no right to sit at her table, only to discover he was her half-brother. Absolute silence gripped the room. The sommelier stood frozen, holding an open bottle of Napa Cabernet at a paralyzed angle. Nolan sat back down at the small table, not out of poise, but because his knees had suddenly stopped supporting his weight. 43 years of defensive solitude came to a screeching halt on the 54th floor, leaving behind a cold, administrative emptiness. Then, Eleanor made a small, choked sound, covering her mouth with her hand, apologizing for showing grief. Nolan crossed the floor immediately. He didn't embrace her. They hadn't earned that yet, but he placed his palm flat on the mahogany table beside hers, close enough for her to touch. She did. Seeing the emotional breach, Victoria's self-preservation instinct kicked in. Desperate to reassert control, she turned defensively on Nolan, demanding to know what his ultimate game was. She accused him of manipulating her mother, cultivating her properties, and engineering a long-con financial ambush. Nolan stood up a second time, and the calm finally cracked, replaced by something much sharper and colder, the voice of a man who had spent 20 years being underestimated in concrete service corridors. He stated plainly that he had requested 0 equity, 0 capital, 0 titles, and 0 consideration. He reminded them that 11 days ago, when Eleanor's estate attorney had floated the idea of amending her trust, Nolan had walked out of the meeting and cut off contact for a week. He pointed out that he had paid for his own DNA test out of pocket, $490, and still kept the physical receipt in his truck dashboard, because men in his line of work learn early never to leave paper trails unverified. Eleanor confirmed every word, adding that she had begged him to accept a portion of her personal holdings twice in writing, and he had rejected both offers. Before Victoria could recover, Preston Kingsley closed his leather portfolio with a definitive snap. "Pierce Operations?" Kingsley asked, pronouncing the name like a missing puzzle piece he had been hunting for months. He turned to Victoria and dropped the hammer. "Our investment fund spent 5 months trying to hire his firm to remediate 11 distressed resort properties across Florida and Arizona. Our diligence team put him at the top of our short list, but he turned us down because his team lacked the capacity to do it right, and he refused to take money to do it badly. We couldn't even get a meeting with him, and you stuck him next to the water pitchers." Marissa Caldwell reached into her leather bag, pulled out an official subcommittee file, and slid it across the table. Inside was an unmailed letter of invitation, dated 8 days prior, nominating Nolan for an outside seat on the board's Operations Advisory Committee. Her board had been actively recruiting the man Victoria had just publicly humiliated for lack of status. Preston Kingsley stood up, announcing flatly that his investment committee would place the $420 million expansion buyout under mandatory review, citing severe cultural and leadership risks within Blackwell Hospitality. Victoria scrambled to salvage the situation, claiming it was merely a localized administrative misunderstanding regarding event security. Marissa Caldwell shut her down instantly. "No, you understood the situation perfectly. You simply misjudged who you were stepping on." Eleanor spoke next, delivering the final blow to any notions of nepotism. She announced that she would recuse herself from any future board vote regarding Nolan, swearing in writing that if he ever joined the company, it would be entirely on the merit of his professional track record, not because of a family bloodline. Nolan didn't want a free pass either. He laid out his own non-negotiable terms for renewing Pierce Operations' master services contract with Blackwell. Transparent vendor auditing. Every commercial property must use a standardized open qualification process so access doesn't depend on managerial favoritism. Independent oversight. Crisis remediation teams must report directly to the Operations Advisory Committee, ensuring operators under audit can't muzzle the auditors. Equitable protocol. Contractors and staff must receive identical seating, scheduling, and speaking documentation at corporate functions, because unwritten courtesy is just an excuse for exclusion. Marissa scribbled down every point as he spoke. Preston Kingsley noted that it was a masterclass in corporate governance. 11 days later, the board convened a special executive session. No one was fired in a dramatic outburst. Instead, a series of dry, systematic resolutions were passed that dismantled Victoria's absolute authority far more effectively than an outright termination. An independent leadership assessment of the chief executive reported directly to the full board annually. Complete removal of vendor qualification authority from the CEO's office, transferring it to the Operations Advisory Committee. A full governance review led by Marissa Caldwell to investigate systemic failures of executive communication. Victoria remained chief executive, but she did so under permanent clinical oversight, a form of administrative purgatory far more painful than being shown the door. Months later, in a wobbly wooden chair at a quiet Hoboken coffee shop, Victoria met Nolan alone. She attempted a fragile justification, starting with, "If I had known who you were." Nolan set his paper cup down. "That's the problem," he interrupted quietly. "What if I were nobody?" She had no answer. She sat in silence, realizing for the first time in her life that her prejudice wasn't an error in execution. It was a flaw in her character. The genetic test hadn't changed her conduct. It had merely stripped away her ability to justify it. Later, in her Upper East Side apartment, Nolan visited Eleanor. He didn't call her Mom, he called her Eleanor, and she accepted the boundary without flinching. They spoke about her early life, the 11 minutes she held him in 1983, and the quiet dignity of the machinist who raised him. 7 months down the line, Blackwell Hospitality signed the expansion agreement with Kingsley Partners at a revised valuation, fully incorporating Nolan's operational governance framework. A year later, at a formal dinner in the exact same 54th floor restaurant, Nolan walked into the private dining room wearing a clean suit, though his shoes still carried the faint scuffs of a working mechanical room. On the primary table, right beside the chief executive's seat, a small card bore his printed name, placed there automatically by an administrative assistant who had no idea of the history behind it. Victoria stood up as he approached. She didn't wait for him to pull out his own chair. She reached down and slid it backward herself. Nolan sat down, looked across the table, and asked how her regional property conversions were tracking. And for the first time since they had met, Victoria Blackwell told him the unvarnished truth, including the parts that were failing. The mahogany table was just wood and linen once again, but the rules of the room had changed forever.